Good morning, everybody. We now turn to regulatory support, which was it's come up a number of times already. This issue of the regulatory part of the process, and I think we're going to take 2 hours now to sort of consider some of the main issues here. I think perhaps I should introduce myself. I'm Elwyn Griffiths. I'm Director General for Biologics and Genetic Therapies at Health Canada, which is the regulatory part of Health Canada, which deals with vaccines, blood, cells, tissues and organs and such like, all the biologics. Before that I was at WHO in Geneva, and before that I was with the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control in UK, very much involved with the EMEA and so on. So moving on into regulatory support, I think we would perhaps all agree that consistent quality, safety and efficacy of a vaccine do play a key role in the success of any immunization program. That's basic. And I believe that regulatory oversight is instrumental in achieving this goal. Because I'm biased, of course, but generally I think everybody would agree that we do have to have a regulatory component there, a very important one. We hear in some quarters about, if you read around these sort of issues, regulatory burden and such like, But here we have to remember what we're dealing with are biologics. These are biological macromolecules, biological processes, biological systems, and they have an inherent variability. And the complexities involved in producing these products are really enormous. People just don't realize that. It's not making aspirin or something of that kind, or Tylenol or whatever you make. So a strong, competent regulatory authority, I think, to my mind, is a distinct advantage to a manufacturer, since he can more easily, I think, than sell the vaccine or supply the vaccine on the international market. Once you've got a well-recognized regulatory authority overseeing these products, it's a sort of kind of seal of approval, if you like. And this is what we'll hear about later on from WHO. This is the pre-qualification system and such like. So I think this is over and above the need for quality and safety and efficacy for the domestic. If you have a very good, strong, competent regulatory system, you then have a bigger markets eventually. Now, in the case of influenza vaccines, the regulatory oversight is even more keenly involved with the whole process than some of the other vaccines. It's involved with the vaccine development, the production, testing, supply, because of the critical nature primarily of the timelines and the whole process of making the influenza vaccines. And so regulatory oversight needs to be well adapted to deal with both seasonal and pandemic situations. So these are just over and above the issue really with just other vaccines. So what we have arranged, or the organisers have arranged for us, is a panel to discuss some of the regulatory support needed for supporting manufacturing and licensing and moving forward and use of these vaccines. Because you have to monitor. It's not just a case of just licensing something. There's an ongoing monitoring issue and post-market surveillance for adverse effects and such like. So these are quite large issues, really. Now, each panel member, what we've decided is to give a short presentation. Four presentations we've made. I should say, not each member will give a presentation, but 4 presentations. Now, if time allows, we can have direct questions for that presentation, just quick clarification. But the main discussion will be later on. So we've got one extra person who's not actually listed in the program, I think, and that's Dr.Maria de los Angeles Cortes from PAHO. So she will speak last. So what we're going to do is to start then by inviting Dr. Phil Krause to start the ball rolling and tell us about the regulatory issues associated with influenza vaccines. Now, Phil is Acting Associate Director for Medical Policy and Vaccine Safety at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, that's CBER, everyone knows is at the FDA. So Phil, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Elwyn. So as Elwyn points out, a lot of the discussions that we've been having here have to do with the question of how does one build a sustainable capacity for influenza vaccine. And sustainable then means that you need to have demand both for especially demand for your annual vaccine, and people need to be willing to take that. And then in addition to that, then you want to have that surge capacity in order to be able to make a pandemic vaccine. But the regulatory piece of this plays a particularly important role is in that annual vaccine and making sure that people have the confidence that's necessary in order to take the vaccine year after year. And so I think there are several different things that go into an individual decision to be vaccinated. One of them is their perception of the likelihood of getting ill, but another one also is their perception of how safe is this vaccine, who's looked at it, who's approved it, how do I know that this is something that is going to benefit me. And that's what the regulatory piece of this is all about. And so I agree with Elwyn completely. I don't think one can stress enough the importance of having strong and competent regulatory authorities that are looking over the production of vaccines as in fact we create this sustainable vaccine production capacity around the world. So what I'm going to do is tell you really about what the FDA does, and then we can look at that and see which of these things can be extrapolated to other countries or to other situations. I'll go through how we license vaccines briefly, and then I'm going to talk about how we responded to the H1N1 pandemic and describe all of the pieces that had to fall into place in order to put together our regulatory response to that. And then I think from that you'll get a sense of what Joan was talking about earlier, is the complexity of all of these different pieces and the large number of things that have to be looked after by a competent regulatory authority. So initial licensure of a vaccine involves thorough review of data which have been submitted by the manufacturer. And there's a large number of things that need to be looked at, and this is not a pro forma review. This is a situation where any one of these things that's being looked at by a regulator could in fact indicate a substantial problem. And these are areas in which substantial problems can also arise after a product has been licensed. But this includes chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. There's preclinical studies, the raw materials, the manufacturing process. We heard a little bit earlier about the difficulty of adhering to current good manufacturing processes, making sure that the proper documentation is in place, and making sure that the appropriate quality control systems and quality management systems are in place. Development of product specifications, where specifications really mean the test results for quality, the stability of the product over time and the appropriate dating period, the assays in their validation, and direct product testing, which is done by the regulatory authority, often for potency, but perhaps also for sterility and other attributes, as well as other things. So this is an enormous piece where the regulatory authority needs to make sure that everything is all right. And even in the developed world, we've had significant problems in some of these areas. For instance, we had one flu manufacturer a number of years ago that was basically shut down for a year due to problems with sterility in a plant. And so although the attempt is to make flu vaccines in a sterile environment, when you bring eggs in from the outside, the situation is not always as simple as one would like. And so having the right kinds of tests in place and to make sure that these tests are properly done and properly validated is really important. Then there's also the whole infrastructure associated with clinical studies. And so this is not only can a clinical study be done, but also, as was mentioned this morning, can one get the right kind of protocols in place? Does one have the right kinds of endpoints for these studies? Does one have the appropriate human subjects protections in place? And then once the clinical studies have been done, does one have the right kind of bioresearch monitoring? Can one go in and actually audit these clinical studies and make sure that the clinical studies were performed in a way that the results are truly believable? And so these are things that are also done prior to licensure of a flu vaccine here in the U.S. And then there's a review of the facilities, which includes not only the floor plan of the facilities and the flow of the manufactured product to make sure that opportunities for contamination problems don't exist, but it also includes going in and doing careful inspections, not only of the actual facility, but also of all of the records to make sure that, in fact, the current good manufacturing processes have been adhered to. In the U.S., we also have advisory committee reviews when we license new vaccines, and we think that's an incredibly important part of public confidence in vaccines, which I think is what the entire regulatory process is buying you, because what that does is it opens up the process. It allows the public to look in on what has the manufacturer done, what has the regulator done, how are we in fact sure that this product is going to be safe and effective. And then, of course, there's a review of the labeling and the indication to make sure that the product is, in fact, accurately advertised based on what's been shown in the studies and that it's indicated for a proper purpose. Now, that doesn't end the regulation system. I'm only halfway through the first slide here. After licensure, there are continued regulatory interactions, and that includes lot release and product testing, where the regulatory authority takes the actual lots which are being given to the public and will retest them very often for potency or for sterility or for other attributes to make sure that the manufacturer's results can be confirmed. It involves manufacturing supplements to deal with minor manufacturing changes over the life cycle of a product, and that happens very frequently as well. It includes inspections, going in and making sure that the current good manufacturing processes are still being adhered to. It involves annual reports from the manufacturers, which then need to be reviewed, and it involves a fairly big piece, as Elwin pointed out, of post-marketing surveillance as well. And this is not only, in the case of flu vaccines, post-marketing surveillance which is undertaken by the manufacturer, so-called pharmacovigilance, but there's also a substantial portion of the post-marketing surveillance which is undertaken by the U.S. government, and the FDA is a big part of that as well. And so the take-home message from this first slide, and this is why I'm taking some time on it, is that vaccine regulation it's complicated, but it's also a major factor in public confidence and therefore in utilization of vaccines. So if one is to have hope of creating a sustainable vaccine production capability in the developing world, having the appropriate kind of regulatory measures in place is absolutely critical. So this slide shows in a graphical way, and I wish it were easier for me to point at these different things, of the interactions between different entities in the production of inactivated, flu vaccine. This slide is for pandemic vaccine, but also covers seasonal vaccine as well. So at the base of this diagram here is the ongoing WHO and CDC global surveillance. And that surveillance is used to determine which strains are likely to infect people and determining which strains actually need to be in the vaccine. And so that's at the heart of this. As our colleague from Japan pointed out, there's a different kind of surveillance which is really important as well, which is the kind of surveillance that tells who's actually getting sick from the virus and who actually needs the vaccine and what is the impact and the burden of the disease. And that's, of course, very critical for the vaccine enterprise as well. Once the vaccine strain or the pandemic virus has been identified, then that virus needs to be turned into some kind of a reference strain or a pre-seed, and that needs to be developed. And that is often a collaborative effort, but the FDA is involved in that, and that involves getting a virus that everybody is confident in actually truly represents the strain that we want to immunize against. And this is then selected in a public advisory committee by our Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. So everything in red here is something that the FDA is doing. And then the FDA also then tests the reference strain physically to make sure that it actually is what it's supposed to be. Then the manufacturers and others, including in academia, including in CDC, including at the FDA, attempt to make reassortments that will grow better and will, whether it's for the inactivated vaccine or for the live attenuated vaccine, the antigens that you want to have in the vaccine need to be reassorted into some other virus which is going to actually be used to make the vaccine. And that's a difficult process because you need to come up with something that's going to grow well enough to support the production of vaccine. In the meantime, also, though, the FDA is taking these reference strains and is starting to make purified hemagglutinin out of that and is going to immunize sheep with that in order to prepare antibodies, because antisera, and has to distribute this antisera because those antisera are an absolutely critical reagent in testing the potency of the vaccine farther on down the line. Once these reference strains are given to the manufacturers, then each manufacturer develops their own seed virus because they adapt that reference strain to their own production process. And so that's something that each manufacturer has to be capable of doing competently and well, and need to be able to do efficiently. When we saw in the case of the H1N1 vaccine this year that, in fact, that's technically not always so easy, and there were some difficulties in getting a virus which grew sufficiently in order to make a vaccine at the rate that people would have liked to have it made. Once the manufacturer has a seed virus, they send that back to the FDA, and the FDA tests that seed virus to make sure that that really is what it's supposed to be, and it really is expressing the antigen that it's supposed to express. And then the manufacturer will make their monovalent vaccine bulk. They will do use a potency antigen, and they'll do potency testing. And that potency testing is also done by FDA in order to assure that the vaccine is adequately potent. And this potency testing relies on the centralized reagents which have been prepared by the FDA. Well, you might ask, well, why can't the manufacturers just prepare those reagents? But the reason is because when you have multiple manufacturers, you want to make sure that the same dose that's made by one manufacturer means the same thing as that same dose made by another manufacturer. So you do need standardized reagents in order to do that. And then the manufacturer will formulate, and they'll fill it into containers. The FDA reviews and approves the licensing. The FDA also will review and approve the lot release, and that then leads to the distribution of vaccine. So where are a couple of other places where things can go wrong? Well, I already mentioned that when you're dealing with eggs, you can certainly easily have sterility problems. In the H1N1 experience, we learned that sometimes you can have difficulty getting adequate growth of the seed virus. We also learned, though, that as we were in a hurry with the pandemic strain, these potency reagents were not available before the first clinical trials needed to be performed. And so manufacturers then need to use alternate potency assays in order to determine what was the potency of their product that was being tested in the clinical studies to do the necessary dose finding. And then those alternate potency assays had to then be cross-checked back against the actual potency assay once those results became available. So that's something that the manufacturers need to be capable of doing, but that's also something that the regulator, as you can see down here, the regulatory instructor is needed to assure that the manufacturing is done according to the license. The regulator needs to make sure that all of this stuff has been properly done. Okay, so this shows the same information in a different way, which is that in the U.S. at least, the influenza season, although vaccine starts being used in September and tends to be used in the fall and winter, the flu season actually starts the preceding January. And it starts with the monitoring and with identifying the strains and starting to develop these reference strains and reagents and come up with the recommendations. But really it takes the full 9 months to do this. And then the manufacturer, is the stuff in yellow here, in general, takes these seed viruses, makes the bulks, formulates in the trivalent vaccine for seasonal vaccine, and then distributes it in order that it can be used in the fall. And of course, this year we had the situation where the pandemic was not declared until early May. And so additional things needed to be done on a much shortened timeline. And so what I'm going to do with the rest of my time here is tell you a little about the extra things that the FDA did in response to this pandemic. And I've already told you about reference strains, seeds, and reagents, and that's something that we had to do all over again for the pandemic strain. So I'm not going to go over that again, but I'm going to talk a little bit about regulatory pathways, I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical studies, and I'm going to talk about enhanced vaccine safety studies. So as far as regulatory pathways goes, and this goes beyond just what the Office of Vaccines did, we made the determination that vaccines from established and licensed manufacturers, which would be licensed as a strain change based on the previous experience over many years and many millions of vaccine recipients. And so that allowed us then to license vaccines based on the same egg-based manufacturing process as licensed seasonal vaccines. The same in-process controls as the licensed seasonal vaccine were used. The same lot release requirements as licensed seasonal vaccine were used. And we used the same clinical data requirements as the licensed seasonal vaccine, which for the inactivated vaccines were not required. We don't require clinical data, but for the live attenuated vaccine, we do require some safety data. And this decision then meant also that U.S. influenza vaccines would not contain adjuvants for the H1N1 flu season. FDA also authorized the use of tests that could detect H1N1 influenza, and that's incredibly important for the surveillance piece of this so that people would understand how likely they were to be infected with this virus. And FDA then also worked to assure the availability of antivirals that could be used to treat H1N1 influenza. As far as clinical studies go, I told you that clinical testing is not normally required for inactivated seasonal vaccines. although the live attenuated vaccine is tested for safety in people before it's approved. But nonetheless, in this case, we were dealing with a new strain of virus. And so the question came up of how do we know for sure what the right dose to give to people is? And while it was our hope that the standard dose for people would be the correct dose, we wanted to be sure that that we actually had the information to support that decision. And so we worked with the manufacturers to develop studies that would rapidly get those data, and we worked with the National Institutes of Health to develop studies that would rapidly get those data. And so we were a part of that because we were helping to monitor those, but we were monitoring those studies as well. And so we were at the center of devising those clinical studies, as well as then evaluating the data from them that then supported the doses that we ultimately licensed. And of course, these studies gave us some additional safety information. And then I just want to say a couple words about vaccine safety and monitoring. Just give you a few perspectives on vaccine safety first. People consider vaccine safety in the context of vaccine benefit. I think that it's important to remember that public confidence in vaccination programs is always important, but it's especially critical when herd immunity is a goal. And in a pandemic, herd immunity is a very important goal. The public generally does not have any more confidence in vaccine safety than it does in the regulatory process. They're relying on the FDA to make sure that the product is actually safe. And public mistrust of one vaccine may spill over onto other vaccines. And so one doesn't want to make a mistake with one vaccine, then have that affect an entire vaccination enterprise. And so the decision was made fairly early on that with widespread use of a new vaccine, there was an expectation that there would be reports of adverse events after vaccination. And we wanted to have mechanisms in place to make sure, to be able to determine if they were truly vaccine associated. So to do that, we worked with various other federal government agencies, whose acronyms are listed here, to improve our ability to assess any reports of adverse events after vaccination. We also are continuing to work with international authorities in order to make sure that we're looking at adverse events in the same way. And a big part of this has been standardizing case definitions so that if a specific adverse event is reported in one country, it means the same thing that if the same adverse event is reported in another country. So that way data from other countries can also inform U.S. decision making. And then we also had, consistent with our desire to make sure that we're operating in public such that people can see what we're doing, we have a separate advisory committee type group which includes outside experts who are helping us to review all of the data that are coming in from our safety studies, and then these data are being presented in turn to our vaccines advisory committee in order to make sure that the public has confidence that this has actually been looked at carefully. So what do we have here? Well, we have a very unique set of circumstances. We have a passive reporting system, which we've had for many years, which is called the Vaccines Adverse Events Reporting System. And there's people who have adverse events will report those events. And if there's serious adverse events, these are all monitored and are all looked at and are all investigated to try to determine whether they could be associated with a vaccine and whether there's an actual vaccine signal. What the U.S. government has done for the H1N1 vaccine in terms of active surveillance, though, is really unprecedented. I've listed here a number of different studies. The foundation of these is the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which has existed for some years, which has, at this point, almost 10 million people in it. But these are people who are under active surveillance. In other words, they're computerized medical records of people, and these records can be queried in a way to determine whether, in fact, an adverse event or some kind of a medical outcome can be correlated with another computerized record of receipt of a vaccine. And so, and if you add these numbers up in all of these studies together, you get about 100 million people who are under active surveillance. Now, not all 100 million of these people have received the H1N1 vaccine at this point, but nonetheless, this creates an incredibly strong and robust opportunity to look at individual signals, to look at adverse outcomes of special interest, to determine whether, in fact, the H1N1 vaccine is causing adverse events that people should be concerned about, and to verify those findings. And the good news is that so far there have been no serious and unexpected findings in these studies as they've been going on. And then there have been additional studies that have been set up by the government as well, a specific study to look at outcomes in pregnancy, the ability to come in and look in more detail at adverse outcomes that are reported to the VAERS system, a specific Guillain-Barré syndrome case-finding study where the CDC is attempting to find as many cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome around the country as they can by working with networks of neurologists in order to determine the likelihood that any of those could be vaccine-associated, as well as an internet-based real-time immunization monitoring system where people who get the vaccine can report directly to the internet what has happened after vaccination. And so this is obviously not inexpensive stuff, but it's something that we regard as being very important to the entire regulatory process and to the public confidence in the vaccine. So, to summarize, the key regulatory activities then, of course, include the vaccine licensure, inspections, and other regulatory interactions with manufacturers. They include coming up with the reference strain, seeds, and reagents. They've included coming up with the appropriate regulatory pathways, our involvement in the clinical studies, as well as in these vaccine safety studies. I guess I'd just like to close by trying to think a little bit about what is the cost of a vaccine. And we had a bit of a discussion yesterday where a lot of people said that if vaccines are made in the end-user country, the cost of the vaccine is almost certainly cheaper than if the vaccine is procured elsewhere. And I just wonder whether, in fact, that really is true. If you count up the true costs of regulatory compliance, if you count up the depreciation on the equipment that's necessary to actually make the machine, you make the vaccine, if you count the cost of training and all of the things that go into this, somebody who's selling a vaccine has to think about what that costs and has to charge one for that. But if one is making it oneself, it's very easy to forget about individual costs when it's trying to figure out what the vaccine actually costs when one is making it on one's own. But so, of course, there is some cost to regulatory compliance, and there's some cost to creating regulatory infrastructure. But we at least believe, and I think the United States public believes, that this regulatory infrastructure is really important. And that's what it is that allows us to have a robust seasonal influenza campaign, to have these vaccines available. And that's what allows us to rapidly develop pandemic vaccines that fulfill the needs that the public health situation thrusts upon us. So, thank you.
I think we'll go on, and because time is getting short, so I think we'll take all the talks and then we'll have the discussion. So let's move on now a little bit from the sort of the domestic, if you like, from the very good introduction we had about what is involved in regulating vaccine, in particular the influenza vaccines. Move on to the international scene, and Dr. David Wood will now move us into that era. He's going to talk about the gaps. I think the title he's used, which you'll see in a moment or so, is the gaps, regulatory, the needs and current gaps, regulatory support. David is the coordinator for quality, safety and standards in WHO in Geneva. Before that, he was with the UK National Institute for Biological Standards and Control. And so, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elwyn. And what I'd like to do is to follow on from the presentation from Phil, which I think has very ably demonstrated the complexity of regulation of influenza vaccines in particular, to look at the need to ensure that capacity is embedded within a broader framework for regulation of vaccines in general. Obviously, it's not possible for an individual authority just to focus on regulation of influenza vaccines. It needs to be embedded within a broader framework, and that's what I'd like to try to address in this presentation, and also to give you some sense of where we are in terms of global capacity to regulate vaccines in general. And I'd like to start off by introducing to you this metric that is used in the area of evaluation of national regulatory capacity. Daniel was asking the question earlier on, is there an international metric for evaluating capacity within countries? And the answer in the area of regulatory authorities is yes, there is. This is a metric that has been developed by WHO over around about a 15-year period of time, and this has been applied in many countries now, and we believe it's a successful metric for assessing the capacity of regulatory authorities. Essentially what we've done is we've identified 6 regulatory functions, which are the ones shown below the red line there, listed down the left-hand column, and within each of those regulatory functions we have a whole series of specific indicators that have been agreed by international consensus to bring together the experts in terms of regulation of vaccine to say what are the essential components that you need to have in place for regulatory authority. And then we've further categorised what we feel is necessary for different categories of countries depending on their vaccine source. And so for countries that are producing vaccines from scratch, that are making the bulk vaccines, then clearly they need to have all 6 of those functions in place. For other countries that are either directly procuring or who are receiving their vaccine through UN agencies, we feel that it is appropriate to have only some of the functions in place. We do not expect every country in the world to set up a regulatory authority the equivalent to the US FDA. That would not be appropriate or achievable, but we do think it is essential that all countries have a certain level of regulatory oversight, to have a process for appropriate licensing of vaccines, and also a system for appropriate monitoring of the safety of the vaccines, the AEFI monitoring of the vaccines. And as we look across the globe and as we look at the experience through evaluating regulatory agencies, we can see that safety evaluation of the vaccine is the weakest of the 6 functions, and that's one that we certainly have to pay more attention to strengthen globally that capacity. So that is the framework under which we work in terms of evaluating and regulatory capacity, and then using that as a way of building regulatory capacity around the world. And what we are trying to do is to use this framework to help us achieve a goal that 100% of vaccines that are used in national immunisation programmes are of what we call assured quality by the year 2013. This is a very ambitious target, I have to say. It's one that is not only a WHO target, but it's one which all the member states have actually signed up to, because this is part of the WHO medium-term strategic plan that all countries agree to in the World Health Assembly. Whether they realise this or not is another matter, but certainly that is the target. The graph shows you the current status of where we are in terms of achieving that goal, and the green bars show you the countries that have achieved functionality against the WHO criteria, and the red where they have not achieved. And the very right-hand bar shows you those vaccine-producing countries. There are currently 44 vaccine-producing countries, 31 of which are functional according to WHO, and 13 are not. So that is our challenge, to try to ensure that those remaining countries do become functional over the next couple of years. That is a pretty big challenge, as you can imagine. And also, as we look at trying to increase influenza vaccine production capacity around the world, we may be looking at some countries that are currently in maybe the procuring, self-procuring group, and moving them into the producing group as well. So again, that's going to bring us challenges. That's what we're aiming to do in the long term, and the tool that we have, which I'll explain in a little more detail, is helping us to get there. If we also ask what the member states particularly want in the area of support for vaccine regulation, the countries want most typically help with crisis management for vaccine safety issues. This is the biggest issue that the countries themselves face, and we've seen a number of instances where vaccine safety issues have basically been, governments have been at risk of being brought down because of inappropriate handling of vaccine safety issues. So as well as the public confidence issues that Phil was talking about, it does have very real political concerns sometimes in countries. And so the countries themselves want support to handle vaccine safety events. Their partners, such as the manufacturers, the development agencies, the vaccine, the procurement agencies, what they want are more and faster licensure of vaccines and pre-qualification of vaccines. So that is the framework around which we are working. Having this metric in place, this international metric in place, WHO has been working over the years to go into countries to basically carry out an audit of the regulatory functionality in countries. We've been doing this for around about 13 years now, with more than 350 country visits. So we build up a lot of expertise in assessing regulatory authorities, some of the highlights that, this is 2008 update, I haven't got the latest update, but for example in 2008 we're able to assess Thailand as being newly functional from their regulatory authorities, and Brazil and Cuba also sustained functionality. And this is an important issue for us, that you've got to not only be able to show a country meets the bar in the first place, but once they've met that they continue to maintain that level of functionality. And we have seen some examples of countries that have sort of met the bar and then have dwindled away with time, and that creates enormous problems if you have a country flipping backwards and forwards between functional and non-functional. So maintaining the functionality is just as important as getting there in the first place. This is the actual process that we use. So the first stage is to define the benchmarks, that international metric in the first place, and we've done that and continue to update those benchmarks as we go along through consultation with the international regulatory experts. We then do this audit where we go into countries, and in our assessment, which typically takes place over 3 to 5 days, we have a team of international experts basically going in to audit the authorities. And whatever authority you go into, when you do an audit, you always find things that can be improved. And so a very important tool that we have developed and find very, very useful indeed is a plan to address those gaps, what we call an institutional development plan. And we found this a very powerful tool indeed for the institution to say, well, this is, we've had an international team of experts come in, these are the gaps they've found, we need to address those. And then that institution can use that with its host government to say, well, look, these are the things that we need to fix. We need support to help us address those needs. We will hear in the next talk some ways of trying to address the gaps that have been identified, but in addition, as we look across the assessments, we can find some general and common gaps that occur in countries. And so as part of the process at the WHO level, we've put together training programs to support countries in the common areas where there are gaps. And then the whole thing needs to be properly monitored and evaluated, and again, harking back to the discussion yesterday, can you have milestones to sort of demonstrate the success of an investment? Well, certainly in the area of NRA assessments, yes, we can. Each time we identify gaps in a national authority, we develop what we've called a roadmap which states very explicitly these are some of the milestones that you need to address in order to get back onto track. And this is something that we can use with donors, and we've used very successfully. And for example, in the case of India, where there was a need to get the authority back to functionality very quickly, we're able to identify very concrete milestones. These are the things that you need to do to get back on track, and we're able to use that with donors who were very then pleased to provide support because they could see whether or not progress was being made. So this is a system that we have in place that we found very useful in terms of the NRA assessment of capacity, and then finding ways to build capacity. Now, we do that on an individual authority by authority basis. But also we're very well aware of the fact that, as I've said, we don't expect every country to come up to have a system in place like we have in the US FDA. One of the important developments that we've seen and are supporting in the regulatory arena is the concept of regulatory networking. We feel that this is an important way to go for the future. There are a number of regulatory networking initiatives underway. I'd just like to draw your attention to one which has been developed for countries in Africa, which we call AVREF, the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, which is particularly targeted at trying to strengthen capacity for evaluation of clinical trials. It's not dealing with all of the regulatory functions, it's just dealing with clinical trials, and it's only focusing on vaccines. It's not looking at other types of medicines at the moment. So basically the need was identified through assessments carried out in countries and a process that was put in place started in September 2006 through a meeting in Accra, and this is basically bringing together 19 countries in Africa to work collectively together on evaluation of clinical trial applications. And we've had tremendous support from authorities such as Health Canada, such as the US FDA, by providing experts to go along and to work with their colleagues from the African continent to examine common problems and to share expertise. And we found this a very useful model, and we just last week, in fact, got some new funding from the Canadian International Development Agencies to support this work for the next couple of years, so that's very much appreciated. And basically what's happened is that the countries themselves have very much realised the benefit of working together in a collaborative sense, sharing the expertise. And for example, this has resulted in things such as joint inspections for good clinical practice of some of the vaccine trials that are being performed in Africa at the moment. So we heard from PATH earlier on about the meningococcal A conjugate vaccine, which has been developed for use in Africa, and the regulators jointly got together and evaluated that clinical trial site. And interestingly, they did the evaluation together. They were able to share, comments and with each other and some of their concerns, but they all went back to their own individual countries at the end of the day and made individual national decisions on what they'd seen. But the fact that they've been working together meant that there was a great degree of harmonisation in the final decisions at the end of the day. And we see that this is a powerful way of informally achieving some networking and consensus around regulatory issues. I'd just like to switch gears just for a minute just to address some of the issues around the post-marketing surveillance for the pandemic vaccine. This has come up in our discussions yesterday. Phil has also mentioned the importance of this, and I'd like to just share with you some of the support that's been provided to those countries that are receiving donated pandemic vaccine through WHO. So as you heard from Mary Paul yesterday, these donations are just starting to roll out to countries and eventually can reach 95 countries, and these are countries that have got the weakest infrastructure in terms of monitoring adverse events. So it's important that we are providing support to these countries as they receive stocks of the vaccines. And so this is some of the type of information that the activities that are in place to help support those countries. So we are providing them with the latest information on the vaccine safety profile, and this is very important that we do this, and the work that's going on at the FDA and EMEA and other regulatory authorities is crucially important for us to build up a database on the safety of the vaccines, because when there are problems, there will be problems when the vaccines are being used in the countries receiving the donations. We need to be able to turn to the record of safety of that vaccine in its broader use, and to understand is this something that's been seen before, or if it's not, or it's different. And so to have that body of knowledge about the safety of the vaccine is very important baseline from which we start. We are and have defined for countries a minimum essential data set required for a situation analysis if and when adverse events are identified as the vaccines do get used. We're providing advice to countries on a format and timelines for reporting that information and the duration of follow-up that they should be looking at. And we're providing the countries with a tool and training on its use that facilitates the accumulation of data electronically and submission and analysis both locally, nationally and to the WHO. And this has been provided by the Uppsala Monitoring Centre, which is a WHO collaborating centre for drug pharmacovigilance. And then, lastly and importantly, we will be providing access to technical advice as is needed. We know from the experience of introduction of newly pre-qualified vaccines into countries around the world, and remember we're supporting more than 100 countries with newly pre-qualified vaccines, that there are often issues when new vaccines are introduced into countries, and basically the countries do turn to WHO for technical advice on how to handle the situations. What we find is that the countries actually are quite good at identifying problems if there are deaths occurring after vaccination, and this will occur. Remember, these are countries that have a higher both infant and adult mortality rate than you would see in the developed world, so deaths will occur in close proximity to the vaccination. These are identified and recognised in countries, and they turn to WHO for support, because while countries may be okay at identifying the event, what is less the capacity, there is less capacity for a causality assessment and assignment of whether or not this is vaccine related or not, and that's where the advice is needed, often very rapidly. So, in conclusion, I think really looking at what would we expect if we're looking at the expanding a functional regulatory base for vaccines. I think these are some of the lessons that we can say that we've learned over the years. Firstly, I would say that influenza regulation should be embedded within an overall regulatory framework, and I think that's a given. I think that the strengthening of regulatory agencies requires a long-term strategy and strong political commitment, and this isn't a quick fix, but I think, as Phil was saying, it's vitally important that this is done because this is the foundation for public confidence in vaccines, and it's not just a national issue, it's an international issue. If there is a bad vaccine in one country, that will affect vaccination around the world. There are several ways of achieving improved regulatory capacity. I've mentioned regulatory networking, I've mentioned some of the training courses that are available through WHO, and we're going to hear in the next presentation I think another way of improving regulatory capacity. But whatever methods are used, I think they should be linked with a specific institutional development plan that is an agreement between the host institution and, crucially, the government in that country to ensure that there is sustainability of the authority. And I think if we look in history, we can see a number of situations where countries have failed to develop sustainable vaccine production, where they have not adequately invested in strengthening the regulatory oversight in parallel with the improved manufacturing facilities. And I think that if there's any one conclusion I would give in terms of how we go forward here, is that the sustainable influenza vaccine production capacity, which is what we're all after at the end of the day, requires a strong linkage between the plans to develop the manufacturing plant and know-how, together with plans to develop this independent regulatory capacity and know-how as well. And we need to have both of those running in parallel if we are to be successful in developing that sustainable flu increased production capacity in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for taking us from where Phil left off after having described the complexities of the regulatory systems for influenza vaccines in general, and moving us into the international field here. There was a comment before coffee about the pre-qualification, and there was a hope that pre-qualification wasn't going to take 2 or 3 years to accomplish. I think you're getting the message. I think here, it's not the actual process, the assessment that takes a long time. It's it's really when gaps are identified, it's actually then the strength and the component of strengthening that capacity in those areas which have been identified as weak. I think it's not the assessment itself, but that can be done in a very short time. It's actually the strengthening part of it. And as David just finished off, it's not a quick fix here. There's a lot of experience for people to learn here. And that takes us on to the next presentation. And that's really moving us on really as an example of how some of the more experienced agencies can possibly help those others which are coming through when gaps are identified. And Cathy Parker from Health Canada will describe regulatory mentoring to strengthen capacity. And this is just a case study, really, and it's not to do with influenza vaccines as such. And as David pointed out, you have to look at the whole issue of the regulation of influenza vaccines in the context of the whole regulatory process. It's not just a little bit on flu by itself. Now, Cathy is the Director of Office of Policy and International Collaboration in Biologics and Genetic Therapies, and her office played a key role during the pandemic situation, the regulatory activities in licensing in Canada. So, Cathy, if you want to come and tell us about what we're doing with the mentoring.
Thanks, Elwin. And just following on Elwin's comments and David's presentation, I'd like to present a case study of how regulatory agencies can work together in direct collaboration to help enhance the capacity in developing countries. Since March of 2008, Health Canada has been, with the support of WHO, has been involved in a mentoring relationship with the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, which is the National Regulatory Authority of India. I think we've heard a few times during this meeting so far about the key role that India plays as a supplier of essential vaccines to the developing world. I'm going to skip through these first two slides because David covered the WHO pre-qualification process in his presentation and outlined what the indicators are that regulatory authorities have to meet. But I'm just going to move into this slide because this relationship between Health Canada and India was born from the WHO NRA assessment process. In January of 2007, WHO assessed Canada's National Regulatory Authority. Within Health Canada, it is the Biologics and Genetic Therapies Directorate, which has responsibility for vaccine regulation. That was a successful assessment, and we were found to meet all of the WHO's critical indicators. Unfortunately, that was not the case later that same year when the WHO did an assessment of the CDSCO in India. That organization lost its pre-qualified status at that time because there were significant gaps in the regulatory oversight identified. That was complicated at the same time with the closure of 3 public sector vaccine manufacturers within India due to lack of compliance with good manufacturing practices. So due to the key role that India plays as a vaccine manufacturer, it was identified that there was immediate action needed to help bring the Indian NRA back up to the WHO standard and bring it in line with meeting all of the critical indicators. So subsequently, WHO recommended that CDSCO seek the collaboration and support of another regulatory authority, one that had been assessed as fully functional and that had experience in training and credibility in vaccine regulation. It was agreed by WHO and India to approach Health Canada to fulfill this role. And we agreed via the Biologics and Genetic Therapies Directorate, which is the vaccine regulatory part of Health Canada. Now, just to clarify that Canada does not import vaccines or other biologics from India. But we did recognize the importance that India plays with the security of the global vaccine supply. And also the government of Canada as a whole had identified that India was a priority area for collaboration internationally. So we had the support of our government, not just our department, but also our government as a whole in this initiative. Unfortunately, it'd be very difficult to describe in a 10 or 15-minute presentation what we went through over the next year in this. So I'm going to focus on some of the key milestones that were involved. In April 2008, BGTD and WHO experts visited India. This was a fact-finding mission. Of course, we had access to the WHO assessment report and the roadmap that had been developed after the assessment, but it was important that we meet with the Indian authorities and communicate directly what kind of issues they had with vaccine regulation and what kind of gaps there were. So this visit revealed a couple of very important things. First of all, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India, the new Drugs Controller General, who's Dr. Surinder Singh, and the staff of CDSCO were very committed to this mentoring initiative. And they were willing to invest whatever time and resources were needed to enhance their regulatory capacity. Secondly, we identified that the struggles that they were facing with vaccine regulation, these were struggles that I think all regulators have. Perhaps the degree of impact they had was different in India, but these were not things we were not unaware of or we had not dealt with ourselves. For example, they had a regulatory system which had responsibilities at both the federal and the regional level. That is always challenging, we find. A lot of trouble with recruitment and training of staff. They had many vacancies within their organization. Overarching legislation that did require some modernization. That was something we could relate to. In Canada, our Food and Drugs Act is decades old. We've been trying to get a bill through our parliamentary process for 3 years to modernize it. It's a challenge to update legislation, so that is not something that is unique to India. A lack of specific guidelines and standard data criteria for manufacturers. This was really a critical gap we identified. And a lack of standard operating procedures for the regulatory staff within the organization. The need to ensure proper documentation of their review and their regulatory activities, in particular implementing electronic systems. And finally, the need to enhance harmonization and collaboration with other authorities. So those were the key observations we made on our first visit there. Oh, sorry. I seem to be missing a slide. Okay, but I do know what it is. Yes. So a key outcome of this first April 2008 visit, we were not intending to make recommendations. It was a fact-finding recommendation. But we did, in the end, make one recommendation to CDSCO, and it was that they require manufacturers to file submissions to them in the Common Technical Document format. So the Common Technical Document is a standardized format for submission dossiers, which was developed by the International Conference on Harmonization. And our thinking was that it wasn't so much that this would give them a common format. Certainly there's advantages to both manufacturers and the regulator for that. But also, more importantly, if they asked manufacturers to use the CTD format, it included, if they followed the template for it, pre-identified data components that should be in a vaccine submission. And that was identified as critical. And CDSCO immediately took action to implement that, and they subsequently followed up with their manufacturers and said that this would be a new requirement. Now, the next thing that happened in this process, which is unfortunately on the missing slide, is in May 2008, so immediately after our visit to India, the Joint Secretary of India's Ministry of Health was Mr. Deepash Panda, and the Drug Controller General, Dr. Surinder Singh, came to Ottawa and met with officials and discussed further this training program and this mentoring program. So that showed the level of commitment at a very high level within the Indian government. So in the summer of 2008, the next step in this process that is key is that 4 delegates from the Indian NRA came to Canada and participated in a 2-week training course on vaccine regulation. Now, these delegates were selected, they were senior people within CDSCO, but senior people at the operational level, not at the bureaucratic level, but people who would be directly involved in vaccine regulation and people who would have responsibility for training staff within the organization. That was a very intensive 2-week period, and we covered, during that 2-week period, basically every aspect of vaccine regulation with these 4 individuals. We went through legislation and regulation, submission processing and screening. A lot of time was spent explaining the CTD format, what it entailed, what type of data submission, what type of data components would be in a CTD format, how to conduct a review of both manufacturing and clinical and non-clinical information, how to do statistical evaluation, lot release testing, GMP, product-specific inspections. We engaged our colleagues from the Public Health Agency to discuss with them aspects of post-market surveillance for vaccines. We talked about patent and intellectual property because it was an issue that the Indian delegates identified as something they wanted to discuss, and also cold chain maintenance is another specific topic they were interested in. So at the conclusion of this training, which was very intense, CDSCO determined that a more enhanced training on 3 particular aspects, 4 aspects, submission processing and the review of manufacturing non-clinical and clinical data was needed. And it was needed to be delivered to a broader group of reviewers back in India. Okay, I've got missing slides here. I don't know what happened to them. It's strange. I'm sorry. Sorry, there were 2 additional sessions that occurred, and there seems to be some missing slides here. In the fall 2008, there was a return trip, BGTD and WHO experts returned to India, and we did in-country training on submission processing and review of manufacturing data. And that was followed by another training session in March 2009, where BGTD staff went back to India and did a second session on review of non-clinical and clinical trial clinical data. And these were delivered to broad groups of staff within the Indian NRA. In that second session in March, we also were accompanied by observers from the NRA of Egypt and Indonesia, and they participated in order to help them develop their own in-country training courses. The training approach for both sessions included both instruction and the use of case studies that BGTD had prepared. Now, the March training session had originally been planned to be held in November. Unfortunately, the terrorist attacks in Mumbai preempted that, and so we had to delay that training. But it had the advantage that by that time, CDSCO had received some submissions in the CTD format, and we were allowed to conduct as part of the training, we incorporated an actual review of those components under the guidance of the BGTD staff. So in addition to participating in the training over this period, which was a year, CDSCO worked very diligently. They filled a number of vacancies among review positions. They implemented electronic and other data management systems. They drafted guidance documents for stakeholders and standard operating procedures as well. So they put an intense amount of effort into this. The outcome was that in April 2009, they were reassessed by the WHO, and it was a positive assessment, finding that they met the critical indicators. It was agreed, however, that we should not stop our capacity building at that point, and we agreed to participate with them in a parallel review of a vaccine submission. So that review is ongoing right now. So in conclusion, this has been, I think, a very positive experience for both sides. It was certainly very resource intensive. We put a lot of effort into the development of training materials and modules, some of which we videotaped so that they could be delivered to staff in the future. But really, it was a very positive experience for Health Canada, and we assume for our Indian colleagues as well. I think the conclusions we want to make from this is that due to the challenges of regulating vaccines, the national regulatory authorities of developing countries require new skills and expertise to assess data and dossiers. Health Canada, in cooperation with WHO, is assisting other NRAs and is willing to continue to do so. We consider that regulatory capacity building for WHO's pre-qualification program contributes to the global vaccine security and public health safety worldwide. We do encourage harmonization with requirements in other national regulatory authorities, such as the use of the Common Technical Document. And we do participate in many other regional cooperation activities as a means to strengthen capacity. In particular, we have been very involved in PANDRA, the Pan American Network on Drug Regulatory Harmonization, in developing documents on harmonized requirements for vaccines based on the CTD format. And as David mentioned, we also have been actively participating in AVAREF, the African Initiative, and we hope to continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. You have to go looking for the lost slides sometimes.
They were all there this morning.
I think they were all there this morning. I mean, I don't know what happens to these slides. Anyway, so thank you very much for giving us a flavour of what mentoring can do. In this case, it wasn't to do specifically with influenza at all. But that's it's an intensive process on both sides and a commitment on both sides to do this. It's not an easy, quick fix. You have to really work hard at it. So finally, then, before we actually open it up for general discussion, I'd like to just get back to the influenza situation, influenza vaccine, and how possibly we can deal with the pandemic situation. And Dr.Maria de los Angeles Cortes has agreed at the very last moment to sort of tell us and brief us about PAHO regional initiatives dealing with the regulatory issues associated with pandemic vaccine, influenza vaccine. Angeles is regional advisor on vaccines and biologicals at PAHO. Before that, she was with the national vaccine manufacturer in Mexico, Birmex, and before that she was with the Mexican Regulatory Agency. So Angeles, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to give you here a briefly summary about the outcomes of the PAHO meeting, reviewing the vaccine regulatory activities for pandemic influenza H1N1 vaccine. This meeting was organized by the Pan American Health Organization, who is the WHO Americas office. PAHO has developed several activities in support to the member states in preparation for vaccinations against pandemic influenza. One of them was the bid solicitation for the pandemic vaccine procurement through the PAHO Revolving Fund. This was performed in September 2009. At the same time, we had prepared some workshops in preparation for the vaccine introduction in the countries and several activities in support to regulatory performance with the countries. Well, the Revolving Fund is a legal mechanism for the vaccine procurement in support to Latin American and Caribbean countries. This is an example of some of the activities. They started in 1979 with purchases for $2.5 million. Recently, the total purchase is $200 million. This is just to show how the PAHO Revolving Fund has been working and the impact that it has been created in the region. And the access to pandemic vaccines in Latin American countries, we have the access for different mechanisms. The purchase that was done through the PAHO revolving funds in the majority of the countries. But at the same time, some countries are doing the direct purchases, some of these countries. And the donation through the World Health Organization, all these countries listed here, they are involved in the donation. The meeting that I am going to talk here was organized in response to the country's request for advice and regulation of the new H1N1 pandemic influenza vaccines, was held in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in December last year. And the meeting objective was to discuss the regulatory issues related with the pandemic influenza vaccine, focusing mainly in license pathways, lot release, and post-marketing surveillance activities. The participating countries are indicated in red, and it's important to notice that we have here involved countries that use South and North Hemisphere composition of vaccines. This creates some kind of complications in the purchase of vaccines. The vaccines submitted for licensing to the participating countries in this meeting, they were the only vaccine that has been introduced in the region is inactivated vaccine. Some of them were adjuvanted, or some of them unadjuvanted, with several adjuvant compositions. All of them based on organic oil in squalene, and produced in eggs or cell cultures with several presentations with single or multi-dose vial or syringe, and from more than 7 manufacturers. And the conclusions that we got from the meeting, it was for license, the commitment or the need to facilitate access to pandemic influenza vaccines of quality in a timely way by establishing fast-track licensing procedures. The license criteria that were discussed and accorded in the meeting were indicated in the WHO document that is indicated here, the Regulatory Preparedness for Human Pandemic Influenza Vaccines. This document was prepared previously for the group of regulators that David Wood mentioned yesterday that has been working internationally since some years ago in order to establish this criteria. And the criteria were based in the public license for national regulatory authorities that are indicated here, FDA, EMEA, Health Canada, TGA, and Japan Regulatory Agency, or based in the WHO pre-qualification. Currently, we have 5 products from 3 different manufacturers pre-qualified, but we expect that in the future we will have only vaccines, influenza vaccines pre-qualified, and then we will have this criteria, the WHO pre-qualification, as the only requirement for to be accepted in the countries. In addition, the regulatory authorities agreeing to request the manufacturers to keep the regulatory agencies informed on the progress in the evaluation of the product regarding the efficacy, safety, and stability, and to present a post-marketing surveillance plans to be approved and supervised by the national regulatory authority. The conclusions regarding lot release is to perform lot release based on protocol review and to avoid testing duplication, taking into consideration the current difficulties in the methodologies for antigen quantifications. And as we mentioned before, the regional post-marketing surveillance activities very much important in this topic. We have the commitment for the countries to establish the baseline values for Guillain-Barré in adults, that the countries will look for mechanisms to encourage the notification of adverse reactions, including Guillain-Barré, anaphylactic shock, deaths, and spontaneous abortions. And we are going to organizing a workshop with national regulatory authorities and immunization programs to coordinate the post-marketing surveillance activities. We have this plan and this international collaboration organized by WHO and FDA, and this meeting is going to be held in January, this January 26th and 27th. But we have the general conclusions from these meetings and meetings sustained with UNASUR. UNASUR is a group of 12 South American countries and Minister of Health from different Latin American and Caribbean countries. First, and very important, the need to generate regional capacity for production and regulation of influenza vaccines in order to be able to respond to pandemics. And we have in development some regional initiatives in vaccine production and that are already initiated. We need to couple these production activities with regulatory activities in order to get independent regulatory institutions in the region to respond to this kind of events. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all the presenters. Thank you, Angeles, for bringing us up to date on what's happening in the region here. So you've all been remarkably patient in sort of holding back on questions. Perhaps I didn't give you a chance to just get the floor, but the floor is now open for discussion. One of the panel members, we only had 4 presentations, so that's okay. I haven't actually forgotten Karen. Karen wasn't actually going to speak, but she's on the panel. So the floor is yours. Questions, comments, and what we've tried to do is to give a broad perspective about the actual, the critical nature of having a strong regulatory performance, regulatory authorities in countries to support the production of influenza vaccines, both the seasonal and pandemic, and that it's not just a case of just sort of licensing the product. It's an ongoing monitoring process, and that actually, I think it was mentioned before, that is resource intensive. It does take money to do that, and it's not just a casual get a few people together and they can read they'll read the submissions. It's a very, very intensive process which involves laboratory and infrastructure as well. So comments from the floor, please.
Could the panel members please comment on the role of transparency in sort of fostering credibility for the regulatory process and how the public perceives, because it's a huge risk with vaccines that the public perception of the safety can go wrong. And do you see how transparency, how much attention should be paid to transparency and disclosure, whether it could help?
Does this work? Hello, I'm Karen Midtoon. I'm the Acting Director of the Center for Biologics, FDA. I think that's very important to have a transparent process. I think that as Dr. Krause was describing, we try to have a process whereby there is public disclosure, for example, of when we are considering licensing a vaccine. And then but going forward, then, I think that we recognize it's very important to be prepared to address, for example, adverse events that may arise, to figure out are those adverse events. In many cases, they end up being coincidental. They're not causally linked to vaccination. But it's very important to have a process whereby you're evaluating that, and that if you do generate a signal, that you publicly disclose that and indicate that you are studying the signal further in some other network that will allow you to actually assess, is there a causality. So, our experience is it's very important to be able to do that. I think, just to add to that, one of the most challenging things that I think we deal with actually is the post-marketing adverse event assessment, because you never quite know what's going to happen, and so you really have to be prepared for a myriad of events, and you really have to be able to jump on those, evaluate them, communicate about them, both during the time that you're evaluating it, as well as what you're finding. So I think that is really very challenging, but a very critical component to ensuring that there is a public confidence, and that transparency is a critical piece, I think.
And just to add from the WHO perspective that we too very much agree that transparency in the workings of the NRAs is absolutely critical, and that is something that we are working on at the moment as some indicators around transparency for NRAs, and we're working with our colleagues in the medicines area as well, so because NRAs deal with both medicines and vaccines, and so we're looking at a general set of indicators that can be applied to national regulatory authorities to assess how transparent they are being. But as a fundamental principle, we think this is very important for regulatory authorities.
One thing I can add as an employee of the FDA is another thing that we have is very stringent conflict of interest rules and regulations that prevent our employees from having any remote financial interest that could have anything to do with the products that they're regulating, and as well as really very careful thought about whether there could be any conflicts of interest in the regulation. When we look at our advisory committee members, we're very careful about vetting them as well. And so I think we're very concerned about transparency, but also going that extra mile to show that in fact decisions really are made as objectively as possible by people who have no interest in doing anything other than carefully evaluating the underlying science.
So my question is to Phil. I think, Phil, you have explained very nicely the regulatory system which is existing in the US. But we do read in the paper that almost all the manufacturers had suffered one time or the other because of the adverse drug reactions or because of the loss of potency, and they had withdrawn some of the lots of this H1N1 vaccine. Do you consider this as a sort of failure on the part of quality management system at the manufacturer, or it was something else?
No, I view this as a success of the regulatory process. This was a very difficult vaccine to make, the H1N1 vaccine, and it had to be made over a very short period of time. As it turns out, perhaps for some of the vaccines, the antigen is not as stable as one might have predicted based on previous flu vaccines. And so, but this shows the absolutely critical importance of having stability monitoring programs in place, as well as having the ability to evaluate the results that come from that in order to be sure that if problems like this occur, that they can actually be dealt with. And so the manufacturers provide that information to the FDA, and we evaluate that and then determine also what needs to be done to assure that it doesn't happen in subsequent lots. So I think this is an example of where, in fact, it isn't just checking off boxes or a pro forma evaluation, but there's a real technical expertise that's required to look at the data and evaluate it. And unfortunately, these are biological systems, and they don't. It would be nice if we could predict them, but in fact, and we can to some degree based on the underlying science, but in fact, there's a lot of science that goes into understanding that. One other discipline that I didn't mention in my talk, but which is critically important for all of this, is an understanding of statistics, because the mathematics and the underlying statistics that are associated with evaluating trends in potency, with evaluating data from clinical trials and things like that, is absolutely critical in understanding what have I actually proved and what do I need to do in order to have 95% plus assurance that this bad thing or this thing that I don't want to happen will not happen. So I would review those kinds of things as resounding successes.
I agree with you. I mean, if I can just comment on the Canadian position as well, I think I would agree exactly with Phil. Same. This has been a very difficult virus to handle. I mean, it was performing, quite unexpectedly. It grew poorly. People thought it was going to go better. It was very different to H5N1, and so having the regulatory agency there behind it is working to a certain extent with the manufacturer. I mean, it's not really that you're really sort of you're really monitoring the situation. They're also monitoring, but biology being what it is, I mean, things are drifting, and I think this is the important point. I mean, it's not the manufacturer trying to cut corners or anything. This is the situation. You need two groups to actually look at these situations, because things can be looking okay over here, but in reality, when you look at the assays on another hand, things are drifting. So I think it's important that that this is a good news story, that the monitoring system did work. We do have problems, but you can actually resolve some of these problems ahead, for the next round, of production, let's say. There was a hand. Sorry.
Hi, thank you, Kathy Newsel. First of all, let me just compliment the panel. That was wonderful. It was a lot of information, and I think you've certainly convinced me about the enormity of this job and the resources required, and the point that vaccine regulation is critical to acceptance that you made. I'm curious, clearly there are always going to be differences in the ability of countries to carry out post-marketing surveillance and how comprehensive those programs can be. So David, specifically in relation to pandemic flu and the donation program, I was very interested in your comments about WHO helping with, the minimal requirements of what that could be. Could you comment further on that, perhaps the minimal time that you're asking for events to be followed, or a minimum set of possible outcomes? Can you give us any more specifics to that pandemic influenza vaccine of what you're looking for in countries?
Yes, we can perhaps share with you. We have an aid memoir that has been developed, which is basically setting out the guidance that we're providing to countries, and I think that's a document that we were posting on our website, so that's publicly available. Some of the things that we're looking at are ensuring that serious adverse events, deaths, for example, are promptly reported to the authorities within 24 hours. We've sort of listed the common adverse events that have been identified with the use of the vaccine so far, so that countries are looking out for those common adverse events. Also, we've identified what are the more infrequent adverse events that have been associated with the vaccine, so that the countries have been briefed on these are the things that you should be looking for if you're able to detect them, to report them as soon as possible. But it's really, for the countries with the weaker systems, it's making sure that any deaths in close association with vaccination, so within sort of 48 hours of vaccination, are reported very promptly. If there are serious adverse events that are thought to be related to the vaccinations, that they are also reported. And in countries with the weaker immunisation systems, we see programmatic errors, as one of the most important and frequent causes of adverse events. So it's not the underlying biology of the vaccine that is provoking an event. It's some unfortunate mix-up or something like that in the clinic which has created the problem. So we're alerting the countries to the types of problems that they may see if they've mishandled the vaccine, that should also be reported through back to the system, central system, and then back to WHO. But I think what we can do is we can provide that aid memoir, can provide that to the organisers here, so that you can share it and see what are the specific information that's been provided to the countries.
Can I just add to that? I think countries working together also increases the database here for adverse event monitoring. And I think there's been some quite successful recent examples that maybe David or Angeles could mention. The introduction of rotavirus vaccine and post-market surveillance for that was done cooperatively, I think, isn't that right, between some countries in Latin America. Perhaps Angeles can mention that, because I think that brought out some adverse events which really weren't associated with the vaccine itself, but it was an administration issue.
Yeah, most of the countries in Latin America, they don't have a system for the acting notification. But for some vaccines that are recently introduced, we are practicing to establish networks. We have this ANIVA network that has been following the introduction of rotavirus vaccine. And we have not exactly an active system of notification, but this is an alert system, more active than a normal passive system, or in some countries we don't have, in fact, surveillance. And we have some success. As David mentioned, most of the problems in your countries is related with programmatic errors more than with the vaccine problems. But we are trying now, working with this international group, to establish some active systems for some countries that have the infrastructure, the adequate infrastructure to develop the surveillance of vaccine. This is going to be the big countries, and some of the small countries we will have just a passive notification that we traditionally have, trying to encourage special attention to this new vaccine.
I think excluding the programmatic errors is an important component of maintaining confidence in the vaccine itself, that it's not the vaccine, but then you can actually correct any errors. Sorry, John, you wanted to comment?
Just to comment on those vaccines in which the U.S. FDA has agreed to be the reference NRA, we also expect the company to report back per the requirements for the U.S. used vaccines, and so we will also be evaluating in the context of our data those adverse events.
Okay, thank you. I can't see around the corner anyway. Oh, sorry. I knew there was. Yeah.
Several questions. The first is to Catherine in terms of you very beautifully described the approach that Canada took with India and the level of effort that was employed there. Is this a routine function of Health Canada? Was this a special request? Is it a program? And my second question is for members of the audience. Are there programs like this anywhere else in the world?
Is this one on? Well, it definitely is not routine. It was a special request, but I think that when we got this request and in our decision to support this, we were forced to look at it in a long-term capacity. It was going to be very resource intensive, and of course in a short presentation like this, you can't describe that. We did 3 trips to India. We sent 3 teams of people to India. I was privileged to be on 2 of those, the first and the last. And we also had Indian delegates come to Canada for extended periods of time. So the resource commitment on our part was very significant. So we had to look at what would we get out of it? And as I said, we don't import vaccines from India. If we did, they would go through our regulatory system anyway. We didn't have any direct concerns for the health of Canadians. But to put that amount of training or effort into a training program, we did have to look at what we would get out of it. And we identified that anything we put together, and we put together a lot of electronic modules. We did do some videotaping of sessions. I think all regulators get, on an ongoing basis, requests from individual countries, can I come and visit you and talk about how you do this? And certainly Canada deals with those requests all the time. So we were looking at, is this material that we could use to address some of those requests themselves? What we ended up doing, partly based on what we put together for India, is hosting a regulatory forum in the fall of 2009. We modeled it after what CBER does, and I'll give them all of the credit and compliment for that regulatory forum. And we expanded it beyond vaccines, beyond biologics, but we looked at ways of harboring all the individual training that we do, including what we put together for India, and putting it into a more comprehensive format that could address multiple countries. The other thing that we identified is that training of internal staff, especially as you bring new staff in, and like all agencies, we're dealing with succession planning, trying to recruit new scientific staff into the regulatory review process, and having to have training for them in a time when we do have fiscal constraints and we can't necessarily contract out or arrange expensive training or send people on training. Putting together material that we could use internally as well would be very advantageous, and we have in fact used that material. So I think that is, we did recognize at the beginning this was going to be very resource intensive for us, so there had to be, in addition to what we were doing for India and for the global vaccine community, there did have to be some internal payoff. This is a long-winded answer, but the other thing I think was an advantage of it is that anytime you're presumptive enough to train another organization, you identify your own weaknesses. So through this process of putting together training for India, we were able to identify where we need to clean up our act. Some SOPs we needed, we didn't have. When we were assessed by WHO, we passed all our critical indicators, no problem, but they identified a couple of weak areas: quality systems and post-market surveillance. So to go and actually train another regulatory authority, you've got to first address your own weaknesses and then pass that on to them. So that provided more impetus. Sorry, probably too long an answer, but that was it.
Yeah, I was going to ask Joan or Karen to actually comment on it, because you have a training schemes as well.
Yeah, we do, and we are of a like mind with Health Canada in terms of that dual duty, recognizing the value of the dual duty that the training of foreign regulators it can also serve to help train your own staff. I think also it's good to observe that this is a challenge for regulators around the world, and there are a number of fora in which we are talking together as regulators to achieve synergy. If in fact FDA knows that Canada is helping India, we're able to help someone else. These kinds of discussions are taking place in the ICH Global Cooperation Group, in the newly formed APEC Regulatory Harmonization Steering Committee, in which we're trying to approach regulatory capacity building in a strategic way. So that you can maximize whatever effort you're implementing to achieve maximum impact. For example, I'm very interested in looking at Health Canada's materials. I think why reinvent the wheel? They've already, videotaped. They have training materials. We're interested in looking at them. In another arena, they've prepared some training materials. A delegation from Health Canada is coming down to FDA. They're going to speak to us about how they train their own staff. There's a wealth of regulatory cooperation going on. I would say this has just mushroomed in the past 5 years, and it's really a hopeful sign. David may want to comment on the ICTRA that's coming up and the pre-ICTRA conference, whatever they call that, the working session, in which there's talking about some of these issues. It's really an exciting arena.
Do you want to say?
Well, just very briefly, IGDRA is the International Conference of Drug Regulatory Authorities, which occurs every second year. This is a meeting where we have the regulatory authorities from over 100 countries come together to meet and discuss common issues. And the theme for this year's conference is on regulatory collaboration. And as Joan says, that's going to be we're going to be trying to learn from some of the examples that we've had of regulatory collaboration and to see how the regulators together can take this forward. The meeting's in Singapore. It's the end of November, very beginning of December, and there will be what is called a pre-ICTRA meeting, which is open to all. The ICTRA meeting itself is closed just for regulators, but there's a pre-ICTRA meeting available for all stakeholders, industry, etc., to discuss in more detail these issues of regulatory collaboration. So again, if that's of interest, I can make that information available through the organisers to these participants.
Can I just, I'll come to I just want to finish off on this particular topic. David mentioned the bringing together of African regulators through AVAREF, and the focus at the present time is strengthening regulatory oversight of clinical trials. With the fact that some vaccines may have to be tested in endemic areas, such as in Africa, malaria and such like, I think it's to everybody's interest, even, to our own interest really, to have these trials carried out in a proper way, because you don't want to waste resources and have trials and at the end of the day they're not not good regulatory oversight of these. So it's to everybody's advantage that when trials are carried out, that everything is they can actually use the data from these trials. So I think it's a win-win situation all around. I think I've got two comments. Two hands are going up. One over the right, and I'm sorry I couldn't see you just for a while. So and there's one behind the lectern here. I'm sorry I couldn't see you because this is in the way. So let's go with Dr. Bloom first.
I would just like to follow up the discussion by saying that I have enormous respect for regulators, and I appreciate how complex and diverse the backgrounds it takes to be a mature, really highly competent regulator. The gap that I see is before becoming a regulator. You're trying to fix something in an educational way in short courses that there is no foundation in terms of career graduate training like a public health degree in regulation. So if I were to suggest to HHS an area that they could foster is some sort of professional training before you become a regulator, so you have the tools that would be needed to do these advanced programs.
Thank you. I think also on top of that, you do have training. You can do training and you can point people in the right direction. There's also essential experience as well, and that only comes with time. And I think the issue of regulators, the more experience working with some of the less experience is also important. I think certain areas, for example, if I can point to David Salisbury here, I'm not pointing at you, David, but in Europe, through the EU, you do have the benefit of a lot of different different regulatory agencies working together from through the EMEA, which brings together some of the weaker agencies, and especially now with some of the recent acquisitions into the EU, they work with the more experienced. And so I think it's a system where everybody is trying to work together, and that the outcome, of course, is the sort of average of all that. So I think there are issues here for gaining experience and not just doing a course. Sorry, I couldn't actually see you behind the lecterns in the way.
Yes, thank you. My name is John Lang. I'm from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I just wanted to pick up on the discussion of Africa and Daniel Miller's inquiry about what else is going on. The Gates Foundation has funded the new Partnership for African Development, NEPAD, which is working with the African Union and the regional economic communities, the Southern African Development Community, the East African Community, ECOWAS, etc., on an effort to harmonize African medicines regulation. The goal is to have cooperation among those communities rather than try to do it African Union-wide over 50 countries, to do it within those smaller regional economic communities for issues such as common documentation, procedure, and decision-making framework, streamlined processes to make it faster and easier for the regulations. The specific aim is to reduce the registration component in the time it takes beneficial therapies to reach patients in need. The overall aim, as befits the Gates Foundation, is to improve public health by increasing rapid access to safe and effective medicines of good quality for the treatment of priority diseases. There was a meeting in Johannesburg early last year. There was another meeting in London that was co-hosted by DFID on this in November of last year, and this is a continuing effort. I'll be making a presentation tomorrow and have a few slides on this for more information.
Thank you very much. David Salisbury.
Elwyn, thanks. Having been put on the spot again, I think it's worth just reflecting a little bit about the situation in Europe, because actually this has not been mentioned hitherto in the last 2 days. And there have been a number of comments, for example, about FDA not requiring clinical trials for strain changes, but actually Europe does. And so there are considerable differences between major regulators that are difficult to justify. And some of the decisions that have come from different regulators, again, are sometimes difficult to perceive quite what the basis for that is. But I think it's worth pointing out that within the European Union, when we were faced with a considerable number of accession countries who did not have very much experience in their own national regulatory frameworks, there was a twinning process set up between the longer established regulatory national bodies and the new accession countries, so that they could at least get a lot of understanding of what the responsibilities were likely to be. And that was very important in terms of, for instance, adverse event monitoring systems. But in terms of regulation for new product licenses, what has happened in Europe has been a move away from national licensing arrangements, so that products have increasingly been registered on a on a Europe-wide basis by a single regulator, which has been the EMEA, which has used expertise from countries to provide the reports, and the licenses are accepted by all of the countries. And I think that this concept of regionalization of licensing has much to commend it as a more effective way, rather than having a myriad of small and inexperienced regulators looking at essentially the same data. So I think that one does need to look at the model that has been developed in the European Union and see how that model could in fact serve as a more effective way than necessarily trying to set up 190 separate national regulators all looking at either the same or very similar data and not necessarily having the strengths that come from such regionalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment, because I think that was an important point, because that's what I was alluding to in a way that Europe is working together. Joan, do you want to comment on that?
I just wanted to respond to that. That, in fact, was a very critical point that was raised at the last ICTRA in terms of not even just developing countries, but countries like New Zealand, who said, we are a small country. We do not have the ability to review dossiers completely. Companies are not coming to our country because we're a small market. We do not want to put up a barrier, a regulatory barrier, if you will. We're losing products. So in fact, some of the topics that will be addressed at the next ICTRA meeting, what the commitment was to explore regulatory leveraging, work sharing, different models, networking. Developing countries perhaps they could recognize approvals by other countries and then add on one layer of their risk benefit for their specific situation, an evaluation, and not do the full assessment. Anyway, some of those are the ideas that will be explored at the ICTRA. Everyone recognizes it's impossible to have an FDA or a European Medicines Agency in every single country in the world, and that would be foolish to try to strive for that.
Thank you. Angeles, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I would like to comment about that. We have been working using these reference regulatory agencies in order to get the license for a lot of our countries. However, the main problem that we are facing now is that all these different manufacturers have different productions. And sometimes they get the license from EMEA or from FDA, and the product that they present to the country is another product. It's even not only different line of production, it's different facilities in different places, and this creates a great complexity. And influenza vaccine is one of the main products where we have a great diversity of production plants, joint ventures, production of bulks in some places, and then the finalization of the product is another place. And this creates a great complexity in the mutual recognition that we would like to follow.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on any of this, David? From the point of view of from during the pandemic, many of the countries have actually been working together as a network, and I think that's been immensely valuable, sharing information in real time. But some of it was done, of course, directly between the major agencies under memorandums of understanding, because there are sort of legalistic issues involved here as well. It's not just simply that we'd like to tell you and share information, but it did work quite well with the WHO, and also through the pandemic part of the memorandum of understanding system. David?
Well, that's certainly true, and there has been this informal sharing of information when there have been real problems to solve on a regulatory basis, and we found a very considerable willingness for information to be shared to solve common problems that have arisen during the pandemic. And I think this is one of the things that we could try and build on and take this forward, into the types of discussions that are going to happen at the ICTRA that's coming up, to see how can that be used to the benefit for other products as well. But I think we also have to recognise that there are restrictions as well on what information can be shared on a legal basis between regulatory authorities, and we also have to respect that, of course, and to find ways of working within the systems that are in place to enable the sharing information as mandated by the legal basis, as well as the more informal ways of sharing information, which have cropped up and have been very effective in the case of the pandemic.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Not a question. I would like to mention one thing that I believe that it is important that we need to be well prepared for the vaccine program. Almost 2 years ago, when we start immunize seasonal flu vaccine to the high-risk group, which is the elderly with chronic disease. And after about 500,000 doses, we found eight cases of serious adverse event that almost killed our program. Some vaccinees died a few days after immunization. There was the rumor among the reporters of the national news media that the vaccine is not safe. But fortunately, we have already set up an independent expert group that they are independent from the Ministry of Public Health. Most of them are from the medical school, and they have investigated all the serious adverse event cases quite quickly enough, and found that they are not related to the vaccine. So we can confirm this finding to the public, and that make our program survive, and we can continue our program until now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Come down here.
Just wanted to give another example of something that almost killed another program and continues to reverberate, and I will defer to my colleagues from Vietnam. But my understanding is that in countries where you have high, for example, childhood mortality, and you're trying to advance in childhood immunization, event of immunization and the neonatal mortality coinciding and not being causal almost killed the hepatitis B program in Vietnam. And it's still, even with the beginning of a influenza vaccination program, the public still remembers that, particularly with H1N1, where you're now telling them you want to vaccinate their young children. So it's a real problem. And once again, I come back to it. We have to invest in educating the press. And that's a long-term investment. That's not a one-off investment. I have actually a question, two questions. I'm sorry to load you up here, but in thinking about our overall objective of the workshop in terms of trying to identify needs and gaps and a way forward, can some of you, either on the podium or in the audience, comment about, is there good synchronization between, say, the building capacity of national regulatory authorities and the program to increase influenza vaccine manufacturing capacity? Are they parallel? Are they coordinated? Is this an area of focus for WHO in particular? Is it a sub activity? And then the second question I have is one of the things that we're experiencing in some of the developing countries with H1N1 vaccine, along the lines of regionalization of regulatory expertise, there are now some delays, even though vaccine is available, in which some regulatory authorities are requesting that new clinical trials be done on vaccines that are already pre-qualified and approved in Europe or the U.S. And the whole concept of not directly applicable, but emergency use authorizations for developing countries. I mean, are these kinds of things being considered in a pandemic scenario?
David, would you like to take a stab at that? Because I think it's...
Well, certainly in terms of responding to the first question, is there some synchronization between the efforts to develop capacity for the manufacturing side and also the regulatory side? Yes, I mean, that's what, from a WHO perspective, we are trying to do, to make sure that those two sort of do go hand in hand. So, as there are assessments carried out in countries about the production capacity, we are also ensuring that at the same time there is, the parallel work going on with the NRAs, and there's exchange of information going on between those two programs. So we are trying to strive to ensure that is happening, and that's an important element of the whole overall strategy. I don't know, Maria, do you want to take the second question?
Is anybody else? Karen, do you want to come?
I think that we at FDA, and I know Health Canada and the whole international community, I'm sure, has worked closely with WHO to really look to them for how can we focus some of our scarce resources. But I do think that a challenge is one of resources within the regulatory environment. We have certain resources, and our challenge really is, how do we use those to do the work that we need to do, as well as to do additional work that we think is really important, just along the lines that Kathy Parker was explaining, because a lot of the funding that comes forward, it can perhaps help with getting a manufacturing facility going, or in other kinds of ways it can help provide, let's say, for travel or other kinds of things. But in a sense, when you talk about strengthening and building a national regulatory authority, that's really a commitment that needs to come from whichever government supports that, and it's got to be a long-standing, sustained commitment, or it's really not going to translate. So I think those are some of the challenges also.
Marie-Paul? We can't hear.
In some countries, the need to conduct trials is in the law, so it makes it very difficult to waive it. And we have had one case with deployment of pandemic vaccine where the country wanted to conduct clinical trials, and a few months before, this was waived by somebody upon pressure of WHO. I think it was for measles, and there were cases of severe adverse event followed by death, and the person who waived authorization ended up in jail. So, in some cases, it's tricky to really go against what is in the law.
Any other comment on that?
Maybe just one thing to add, and that is, I think one of the things that's come up is it's very difficult to create this just starting with flu. And so if you start off with countries which are already producing some vaccines and have already started to develop some regulatory infrastructure, then you can start building this onto that. And it sounds like that's the approach that the WHO has taken as well, is to identify the places that are ready for these development efforts.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. It's now just on 12:30, and I think we should draw to a close. But sort of moderator's prerogative, I'm going to ask the panel for a comment here. We heard this morning from PATH about the push to develop new technologies for vaccine, new platforms and such like, the recombinant DNA platforms and such like. This would be in a developing country situation, as I understand it. What's the panel's view about the wisdom of trying to license a newly developed sort of new technology type vaccine with a less experienced regulator? Or, is this a situation where the less experienced regulator should, if this starts to happen, that they should get help from WHO to deal with some of these issues? It's just I'm just a little bit uneasy about how when these new products come along, new technologies, there may be some issues there. I can't think of one offhand, which may be a problematic, a safety issue, and which some of the more experienced might have some information. So if I can ask my colleagues here if they can just answer that very quickly. David's waving to go there, and then I'll ask Karen afterwards.
Well, I think it's a very pertinent point, Elwyn, and it's something that we see, and it's been one of the imperatives, if you like, behind the development of the AVRF, because what we were seeing there was that there were a number of products that were being developed for dealing with HIV vaccine, HIV, TB, for example, malaria, and the vaccines that have been developed are very complex products. These are really cutting edge, and these are going to be challenging for even the most best resourced regulatory authorities. Yet these trials were going to be carried out in countries with very under-resourced regulatory authorities, and I think that this is a clear example, and probably with the new flu platforms as well, this will be a clear example of where collaboration between the best resourced regulatory authorities that do have the history of dealing with these products will be crucial and very important to ensure that wherever they may be developed in the world, that if we can try and set up that collaboration between the regulatory authorities, that would be of benefit to all, I'm sure.
Karen, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I agree with David. I would add one additional facet. Once one makes a decision to license a new vaccine, one typically with a new vaccine may have a database of 5, 10, 15,000, whatever. And obviously it's substantial, but it's very, very small relative to the millions of people one envisions many vaccines being given to. So that transition from going from we've just licensed this product with this database to we're now rolling it out and giving it to many millions, it's so critical to really be set up to evaluate what happens as you go forward. That post-marketing surveillance is so critical with the introduction of new vaccines. And I think that what we're talking about here is a shift in paradigm, because I think a lot of vaccines in the past had substantial use elsewhere before they perhaps went into areas where there wasn't as strong a post-marketing surveillance capacity. So I think that figuring out how to really be prepared to do good surveillance for new vaccines being newly introduced into areas that perhaps don't have that much strength to do that is really pivotal.
Angeles, do you want to comment at all? Because I think it's sometimes it's a pressure on the less developed agencies that they're pressurized by manufacturers and to do something and move. Sorry, Angeles.
We realize that this has been a very important opportunity to detect some of the needs of weaknesses in the region, and several regional initiatives now are starting to work. One very important related with the production of influenza, because in fact we don't have regional production at the moment for this vaccine, and at the same time the regulatory authorities has to grow with this production, and at the moment we have to depend of the criteria of the strongest regulatory authorities in the world. And we would like as well, we are working with some of them to get the commitment as well to receive their support and to work at the same time in training with the regulatory authorities to face this kind of problems that we didn't have before.
Kathy?
Yeah, just one comment. There's an aspect to that I don't think has been mentioned yet, and it's not just the regulatory agencies, newer ones or from developing countries, having the capacity to review these submissions, but there also is responsibility and onus to assure that what is submitted to them by a manufacturer is the same dossier that is received by other regulators. And the fact that a country is a developing country is not an excuse or a reason for incomplete information to be submitted, and I know that we saw that in our experience with India, where submissions that came in, we saw submissions being delivered to that regulatory agency while we were there that were definitely not the same size as the ones we had reviewed. And when we did a comparison and we discussed it in detail, it was quite apparent that there were different standards of evidence being filed to these countries. So I do believe there is work to be done with the manufacturers on that point.
Okay, and with that then, the time has gone on. I think we do have to come to a close. So can I thank my colleagues on the panel here for their invaluable contribution to some of the issues this morning, and to you, the audience, of course, for your thought-provoking comments and questions. And I hope that we have convinced you that the regulatory aspects really do deserve considerable thought and support, because as you move forward for this sustainable influenza vaccine production, that is an important component of all this. So thank you very much indeed.